Hey guys, welcome to the 20-second C programming tutorial, and in this tutorial we're going to continue looking at functions. And in the previous tutorial we built this function called printError, and this function called printError got information from the caller. Specifically, it got a character array and an integer. Now let's say that we wanted to make our function give information back to the caller. So let's say that we wanted our function to do some sort of calculation and then give the answer to that calculation back to the caller. So let's just say that we wanted to make a function that would add two numbers together and then just give their sum back to the caller. So what we're going to do right here is just create the prototype for that function. So I'm just going to go up here and create the prototype right next to my other one. And the first thing that I want to do is just write out the type of data that I'm going to be giving back to the caller. And I'm going to be giving an integer back to the caller since it's going to be the sum of two numbers. So I'm just going to go ahead and type int. And then following that, I'm just going to want to go ahead and name my function. I'm going to go ahead and call it add since that's what our function is going to do. It's just going to add two numbers together. And our function is going to need to take two parameters, specifically the two numbers that we add together. So it's going to take one integer, so I'm going to call it int num1, and another integer, so I'm going to say int num2. Alright, and then I'm going to go ahead and end that line with a semicolon. Alright, so now that we've got the prototype built for our function, let's just go ahead and copy this prototype and actually build the code for the function itself. So after I just go ahead and paste the prototype down here, I just need to put two curly brackets after that function, and inside of here is where we're going to want to type all the code that our function is going to do. And like I said, what we want our function to do is just add these two numbers together, num1 and num2, and give the caller back their sum. So the first thing that I'm going to do is just create an integer variable to store the sum of these two numbers. So I'm going to say int sum equals num1 plus num2. So now inside of this integer variable called sum, we have the sum of num1 and num2. Now in order to give this information back to the caller, so in order to give this sum variable back to the caller, what we have to do is something called return it. So what I'm going to do is just type the return keyword, and then following that type the information that we're going to be giving back to the caller. And we said that we're going to be giving an int or an integer back to the caller. So that's what we need to return. We need to return an integer. And we're going to be returning this integer variable called sum that holds the sum of num1 and num2. So I'm just going to say return sum. Now let's go up to this main right here and just call this add function. So I'm going to say add, and then I just need to pass through two numbers as parameters. I'm going to go ahead and add the numbers 3 and 5. And since this function returns a number, what I can do is say int I equals, and then it just goes ahead and calls this function. It goes ahead and calls this add function and sets num1 equal to 3 and sets num2 equal to 5. Then what it does is it says num1 plus num2. The value of num1 is 3, the value of num2 is 5, so it does 3 plus 5 is 8 and stores 8 in the sum variable, and then returns the value of the sum variable, which is 8. So now what it does is it sets I equal to 8. So it just sets I equal to whatever is returned from this add function right here, and 8 is returned from this add function. So if we were to print out I onto the screen, we should just get 8. So I'm just going to say printf, and we just want to print out an integer variable, so modulus I, end the line right there, and we want to print out the variable I, so I'm just going to type I right there. Alright, so let's just go ahead and run this, and we should get 8 out onto our screen since the sum of 3 and 5 is 8. Yep, 8, perfect. Alright, so let's just say we wanted to add two other integers together, like 10 and 2, and we should get 12. Alright, perfect, it works. Now let's just say that we wanted to make another function that multiplies two floats together and gives a float back to the caller. So let's just go ahead and build a function for that. So again, we're going to be giving information back to the caller. So we're going to have to type float since we're going to be giving a float back to the caller. And we're going to be multiplying two numbers in this function. So I'm just going to go ahead and call this function multiply, and this function is going to take two parameters, the two numbers that we want to multiply together. So I'm going to say float f1 and float f2. Alright, so now we basically just built the prototype for our multiply function. So let's just go ahead and copy this prototype, paste it down here, and then after that put two curly braces, and inside of these curly braces is where we're going to want to type all the code that our function is going to do. And like I said, we just want our function to multiply these two numbers together and then return their product. So give that product back to the caller. And in this function right here, I basically created a separate variable called sum just so you could see this better, but we can actually avoid creating another variable. We can actually just go ahead and do return and then f1 times f2. So basically what it's going to do is it's just going to multiply f1 and f2 together and then return their product back to the caller. So let's just go ahead right here and call this multiply function. So I'm going to say float f equals multiply, and then we're just going to have it multiply together 2 and 3. So now basically what it's going to do is it's going to see this multiply function right here and come down here to our multiply function. It's going to set f1 equal to 2 and f2 equal to 3. Then it's going to multiply their two values together, so multiply f1 and f2 together. f1 is 2, f2 is 3, so the product of 2 and 3 is 6. So it's going to return that 6 back to the caller, and it's going to store 6 in this float variable called f. So now if I were to print out f onto the screen, this float variable, we should get 6. So I'm just going to say print f, and I'm just going to go ahead and do modulus point to f, so we're just formatting that so there's only 2 digits after that decimal point, and then we just want to print out our float variable called f. So let's just go ahead and run this, and we should get 6 out onto the screen since 2 times 3 is 6. Yep, perfect. Alright, so before I end this tutorial, let me just go ahead and explain why we put void for the first function that we created. So the first thing that you type when you create a function is actually called the return type. So in these two functions that we created today, we put int and float, since that was the two types of data that we returned from our functions. In our add function, we just returned the sum of our two integers that we passed through, and in our multiply function, we just returned the product of the two floats that we passed through. But for this print error function, we didn't return anything back to the caller, so we just put void right there, and that just means that no information is being returned or given back to the caller. So if you don't want your function to give any information back to the caller, you're just going to want to go ahead and make that return type right there void. Alright, so that's pretty much it for this tutorial, so see you guys.